Before we begin, if you enjoy these BL storytelling videos and want to support the continuation of this channel, you can join my Patreon, SpicyTimeBL. YouTube does not always make it easy to monetize this kind of content, so Patreon really helps me keep creating these stories. You can find the link in the description and pinned comment. And for those who want the continuation of the videos, bonus scenes, early access, and more uncensored 18+ BL content, SpicyTimeBL is where you can find it. Have you ever met someone who just completely terrified you and fascinated you at the exact same time? Someone whose mere presence in a room makes the air feel heavy, makes your heart beat just a little bit faster, and makes you suddenly hyper-aware of every single breath you take? That is exactly what happened to Julian. Julian Hayes was 28 years old, and he loved his life. He was a literature teacher at St. Jude's Academy, a prestigious, ivy-covered private high school that looked like it had been pulled straight out of a Gothic novel. Julian was the kind of teacher students adored. He was deeply passionate, a little bit chaotic, and completely devoted to his job. His desk was always a disaster zone of ungraded essays, classic novels with broken spines, and half-empty coffee cups. He usually had ink smudged on his fingers, and his tie was never, ever pulled tight. He was comfortable. He was happy. Until the old principal retired, and he arrived. Arthur Sterling. At 35, Arthur was incredibly young to be the principal of such a highly regarded academy. When the announcement was made, rumors spread like wildfire through the teacher's lounge. People said he was a corporate shark, brought in by the school board to cut budgets, fire underperforming staff, and turn their beloved, historical school into a soulless, money-making machine. Julian was prepared to hate him. He was prepared to fight for his arts programs, for his literature budget, and for the soul of the school. But nothing, absolutely nothing, prepared Julian for the reality of Arthur Sterling in the flesh. I want you to picture the first staff meeting of the year. It's late August. The teachers are gathered in the grand library, sitting in leather chairs, murmuring anxiously. The heavy oak doors open, and the room instantly goes dead silent. Arthur walks in. He doesn't just walk, he commands the space. He is tall, impeccably dressed in a dark, tailored three-piece suit that looks like it cost more than Julian's car. His dark hair is styled perfectly, sweeping slightly over his forehead but kept strictly in place. His jawline is sharp, his posture rigid, and his eyes— when Julian first saw his eyes, he literally forgot how to breathe for a second. They were a striking, piercing shade of stormy gray, cold, calculating, and completely unreadable. Arthur stood at the front of the room, looking over the staff. He didn't smile. He didn't offer a warm, welcoming speech. He just adjusted his silver cuffs, looked at the crowd, and began speaking in a voice that was deep, smooth, and resonant. A voice that seemed to vibrate right against Julian's ribs. "Good morning. I am Arthur Sterling. I believe in discipline. I believe in excellence, and I do not believe in wasting time. This school has a reputation, and we are going to maintain it. I expect perfection, nothing less." Julian swallowed hard, slumping down a little in his chair. Oh, this was going to be a nightmare. This man was a robot, an incredibly handsome, terrifying robot in a three-piece suit. As Arthur continued to speak, listing his new policies and budget reviews, his stormy gray eyes scanned the room. And then they stopped. They locked directly onto Julian. Julian was sitting in the middle row, his messy brown hair falling into his eyes, a pen tucked behind his ear, wearing a tweed jacket that had seen better days. He felt the weight of Arthur's gaze pin him to his seat. The eye contact lasted only 3 seconds, but to Julian, it felt like an hour. There was a sudden, electric jolt in the air. Julian felt his face grow hot, and he quickly looked down at his notebook, his heart hammering against his ribs. Why did he feel like he had just been caught doing something wrong? For the first month of the semester, Julian tried to avoid the new principal as much as humanly possible. He stayed in his classroom, he avoided the main office, and he kept his head down. But at a school like St. Jude's, avoiding the principal is impossible, especially when the principal seems to be everywhere you are. It started with small things. Julian would be walking down the echoing, oak-paneled hallways, laughing loudly with some of his students, and he would suddenly feel eyes on him. He'd turn around, and there, standing at the end of the corridor, would be Arthur, just watching, his hands clasped behind his back, his expression unreadable. Whenever Julian caught him looking, Arthur wouldn't look away. He would just hold the stare until Julian, flustered and blushing, broke the eye contact first. Julian didn't know what to make of it. Was he in trouble? Was Arthur evaluating him? Why did those stormy gray eyes always seem to find him in a crowded room? The real tension between them, the spark that ignited everything, happened in late October. Julian was furious. He had just received an email stating that the budget for the winter theater production, which Julian directed every year, was being slashed by 30%. Julian didn't think. He just reacted. He stormed out of his classroom, marched straight down the hall, past the stunned secretary, and burst into the principal's office without knocking. "You can't do this!" Julian practically yelled, slamming the printed email onto Arthur's massive mahogany desk. Arthur had been reading a file. He didn't flinch when Julian slammed the paper down. He slowly, deliberately closed his file, took off his silver-rimmed reading glasses, and looked up at Julian. The silence in the office was deafening. The only sound was the ticking of the antique grandfather clock in the corner. "Mr. Hayes," Arthur said, his deep voice dangerously calm, "I assume you are familiar with the concept of knocking." Julian flushed deeply, suddenly realizing how reckless he was being. But his passion for his students pushed him forward. "I'm sorry, sir, but you can't cut the theater budget. These kids need this play. It's the only place some of them feel like they belong. You can't just come in here and strip away the arts because it doesn't look good on a spreadsheet." Arthur stood up. He was taller than Julian by a good 4 inches, and as he stepped around the desk, Julian instinctively took a half step back. The proximity was overwhelming. Up close, Arthur smelled like expensive cedarwood, bergamot, and rain. It was a deeply masculine, intoxicating scent that made Julian's head spin. Arthur stopped just a foot away from Julian. He looked down at him, his stormy eyes trailing over Julian's messy hair, his flushed cheeks, and the ink stain on his collar. "I am not stripping away the arts, Julian," Arthur said softly. It was the first time he had used Julian's first name, and the way it rolled off Arthur's tongue made a shiver run down Julian's spine. "I am reallocating funds to fix the heating in the East Wing so your students don't freeze in the winter. If you had bothered to read the second page of the email, you would know that." Julian froze. He felt the blood drain from his face. Oh, God. He hadn't read the second page. He had just seen the cut and lost his mind. Julian stammered, his usual quick wit completely vanishing under Arthur's intense gaze. I'm sorry. I should have read it." Arthur didn't move away. He stayed close, so close that Julian could feel the warmth radiating off his suit. The strict principal looked down at the flustered, passionate young teacher, and for a split second, Julian swore he saw a flicker of something soft, something incredibly tender, cross Arthur's usually stone-cold face. "You are very protective of your students," Arthur murmured, his voice dropping an octave, becoming almost a whisper. "They mean everything to me," Julian whispered back, unable to break the magnetic eye contact. Arthur's eyes dropped to Julian's lips for a fraction of a second, so fast Julian thought he might have imagined it. Then, Arthur stepped back, the invisible spell between them breaking, and the cold mask slipped right back into place. "Read your emails thoroughly from now on, Mr. Hayes. Dismissed." Julian practically fled the office, his heart beating so fast he thought he was going to pass out. What was that? What was that heavy, suffocating tension between them? Why did he suddenly want to reach out and touch the lapel of Arthur's perfect suit? From that day on, everything shifted. It was no longer just fear or annoyance. It was an intense, undeniable, vibrating awareness. They were like two magnets, constantly pulling toward each other, even when they were trying to stay apart. November brought heavy rains and early dark evenings to St. Jude's. Julian was the kind of teacher who always stayed late. He loved the quiet of the school after the students left. He would sit at his desk, a small desk lamp casting a warm golden glow over his chaotic piles of paper, grading essays while listening to the rain hit the stained glass windows. One Thursday evening, it was particularly stormy. The rain was lashing against the glass, thunder rumbling in the distance. Julian was exhausted. He had been working on a complex lesson plan, and without realizing it, he had folded his arms on his desk, rested his head down, and fallen fast asleep. He didn't hear the heavy oak door of his classroom open. He didn't hear the quiet, measured footsteps crossing the wooden floor. Julian woke up slowly, feeling surprisingly warm. The air in the classroom was usually freezing after 6 p.m., but he felt wrapped in something heavy and incredibly soft. He blinked his eyes open, rubbing his face, and sat up. A dark wool trench coat slid off his shoulders and pooled onto his lap. Julian stared at it. It was expensive, heavy wool, lined with silk. It smelled powerfully of cedarwood and bergamot. Arthur's coat. Julian snapped his head up and looked toward the door. Arthur was standing there, leaning casually against the doorframe, wearing only his suit vest and shirt sleeves, his tie slightly loosened. It was the most relaxed Julian had ever seen him. "You're going to ruin your neck sleeping like that, Julian," Arthur said quietly, his voice cutting through the sound of the rain outside. Julian clutched the heavy coat in his hands, feeling his face heat up. "Mr. Sterling, I didn't mean to fall asleep. What time is it?" "It's past 8, Arthur said, stepping into the dimly lit room. He walked slowly toward Julian's desk. The golden light from the lamp caught the sharp angles of Arthur's face, making him look breathtakingly handsome. "You work too hard. I've noticed you're the last car in the parking lot almost every night." Julian's breath hitched. Arthur was paying attention to his car? Arthur noticed when he left? I have a lot of grading," Julian said weakly, holding the coat up. "Thank you. For the coat." "You didn't have to." Arthur stopped right in front of the desk. He looked down at Julian, who was still sitting in his chair, looking up at him with wide, sleepy brown eyes. The silence stretched between them, heavy and thick with unspoken words. Arthur reached out. Julian stopped breathing. Arthur's large, warm hand hovered in the air for a second before his fingers gently brushed against Julian's cheek, pushing a stray lock of messy brown hair behind Julian's ear. The touch was so light, so incredibly gentle, that it sent a shockwave of electricity straight to Julian's toes. "Go home, Julian," Arthur murmured, his eyes dark and intense. "Get some rest." Before Julian could find his voice, Arthur turned and walked out of the classroom, leaving Julian sitting in the dark, clutching the warm trench coat to his chest, his heart threatening to beat right out of his ribcage. And just a small reminder, if you want more story continuations, bonus scenes, early access, and uncensored 18+ BL content, you can support me on SpicyTimeBL. The link is in the description and pinned comment. The dynamic between them after that night was agonizing. The slow burn was driving Julian absolutely crazy. In public, during staff meetings or in the hallways, Arthur was still the strict, unapproachable Mr. Sterling. But behind closed doors, or in the quiet moments when no one else was looking, everything was different. When Julian would hand in his weekly reports, Arthur's fingers would deliberately brush against his. When Julian spoke in meetings, Arthur would watch him with an intensity that made Julian's skin prickle. Sometimes, Julian would find a fresh, hot cup of expensive coffee sitting on his desk in the morning, with no note. But he knew exactly who it was from. Julian was falling. He was falling so deeply and so hard for a man who was supposed to be his boss, a man who intimidated everyone else, but who wrapped his coat around Julian when he was cold. But with this growing closeness came something unexpected: jealousy. It happened right before the Christmas break. The school had hired a new, temporary substitute teacher for the history department. His name was Mark. Mark was young, athletic, blonde, and incredibly flirtatious. And from the moment he arrived, he seemed completely obsessed with Julian. Mark was always hanging around Julian's desk, laughing loudly, touching Julian's shoulder, and inviting him out for drinks. Julian, being naturally polite and slightly oblivious, didn't think much of it. He was just being friendly. But Arthur noticed. Oh, Arthur noticed everything. One afternoon, in the crowded staff lounge, Julian was trying to make photocopies. Mark was standing right behind him, leaning in close, trapping Julian against the copier. "Come on, Julian," Mark laughed, his hand resting casually on Julian's waist. "Let me take you to dinner tonight. You need to get out of this dusty old building." Julian laughed awkwardly, trying to gently step away. "Mark, I really have a lot of work to do." "Mr. Hayes." The voice cracked through the staff lounge like a whip. Everyone in the room froze. Arthur was standing in the doorway. He looked absolutely terrifying. His posture was rigid. His jaw was clenched so tight a muscle ticked in his cheek, and his stormy gray eyes were completely fixed on Mark's hand, which was still resting on Julian's waist. The temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. "Mr. Hayes," Arthur repeated, his voice dangerously low, practically vibrating with suppressed anger. "I need you in my office. Immediately." Julian swallowed hard, slipping out from under Mark's arm. "Yes, Mr. Sterling." Julian followed Arthur down the hallway. Arthur's strides were long and furious. When they reached the office, Arthur walked in, waited for Julian to cross the threshold, and then slammed the heavy oak door shut behind him with a loud bang. Julian jumped, spinning around to face Arthur. Arthur didn't go to his desk. He walked straight toward Julian, backing him up against the heavy wooden door. Julian's breath caught in his throat as Arthur boxed him in, placing one hand flat against the door right beside Julian's head. Arthur was so close that Julian could feel the heat radiating off his body, could see the tiny flecks of silver in his furious gray eyes. Arthur's chest was heaving slightly. "Are you close with him?" Arthur demanded, his voice a harsh, raw whisper. With Mark?" Julian stammered, his mind spinning, his heart hammering against the wood of the door. "No, I barely know him. He's just a substitute." "Then why was his hand on you?" Arthur asked, his gaze dropping to Julian's lips, then snapping back up to his eyes. The jealousy radiating from the usually composed principal was suffocating, intoxicating, and undeniably protective. "I don't know," Julian whispered, feeling incredibly bold in the heated space between them. "Does it bother you, Arthur?" Arthur froze. It was the first time Julian had ever used his first name. Hearing it come from Julian's lips, soft and breathless, seemed to break something inside the older man. Arthur closed his eyes for a second, a look of profound pain and longing crossing his face. He rested his forehead gently against Julian's. Julian gasped softly at the contact, closing his own eyes, melting into the warmth of the man in front of him. "It bothers me more than you could possibly imagine," Arthur whispered, his voice cracking with emotion. His hand moved from the door to gently cup the side of Julian's neck, his thumb tracing the line of Julian's jaw. "I am losing my mind over you, Julian. I sit in my office all day, and all I can think about is your messy hair, your ink-stained fingers, and the way you look at me when you think I'm not paying attention." Julian's breath hitched. He brought his hands up, hesitantly gripping the lapels of Arthur's pristine suit. "I'm always looking at you," Julian confessed softly into the quiet space between them. Arthur groaned quietly, pressing his forehead harder against Julian's. "This is dangerous. I am your superior. I am supposed to protect this school, but all I want to do is protect you. Then protect me," Julian whispered, looking up, his brown eyes full of absolute trust and longing. The tension snapped. Arthur's control completely shattered. He tilted Julian's chin up and pressed his lips against Julian's. It wasn't a gentle, hesitant first kiss. It was desperate, deeply emotional, and full of months of repressed longing. Arthur kissed him like he was dying of thirst, his large hands moving to grip Julian's waist, pulling him flush against his chest. Julian let out a soft, breathless sound, wrapping his arms tightly around Arthur's neck, pulling him closer, kissing him back with everything he had. The kiss tasted like coffee, mint, and pure electricity. Arthur's hands were possessive but incredibly careful, mapping the shape of Julian's spine, holding him as if Julian was the most precious thing in the world. Julian felt his knees go weak, completely overwhelmed by the strength and warmth of the man holding him. When they finally broke apart, both of them were breathing heavily. Arthur kept his arms wrapped tightly around Julian's waist, resting his chin on top of Julian's head, holding him in a deep, protective embrace. Julian rested his cheek against Arthur's chest, listening to the rapid, thundering beat of Arthur's heart. "Arthur," Julian whispered softly, the name tasting so sweet on his tongue. "You're going to be the death of me, Julian Hayes," Arthur murmured into his hair, his voice thick with affection. "But I don't care. You're mine. I'm not letting anyone else look at you the way he did." Julian smiled against the wool of Arthur's suit, feeling a deep, radiating warmth spread through his entire body. "I don't want anyone else looking at me anyway." The transition from being colleagues to lovers was a dangerous, thrilling secret. To the rest of the school, they were still the strict principal and the chaotic literature teacher, but the secret glances they shared in the hallways were now loaded with intimacy. When they passed each other in the corridor, the backs of their hands would brush for just a second, a fleeting, invisible touch that left Julian buzzing for hours. Arthur became deeply protective of Julian. He made sure Julian never worked past 7 p.m. If Julian tried to stay late, Arthur would simply walk into his classroom, shut Julian's laptop, pack his bag, and walk him to his car in the freezing winter air, holding his hand in the dark shadows of the parking lot where no one could see them. Julian, in turn, learned how to soften the strict principal. He learned that Arthur carried the weight of the school board's expectations on his shoulders. He learned that Arthur had a dry, brilliant sense of humor that he only ever showed to Julian. Julian would sneak into Arthur's office during his free periods, locking the heavy oak door behind him, just to steal a few quiet minutes of kissing Arthur against his mahogany desk, messing up the principal's perfect tie, leaving Arthur looking flushed and incredibly handsome. But secrets like this, in a place like St. Jude's, are fragile. The true test of their relationship came in the spring. The school board was holding its annual performance review, and the chairman of the board, an old, incredibly strict man named Mr. Vance, decided that Julian's teaching methods were too unorthodox. Julian didn't use standard testing. He made his students write poetry, perform plays, and debate philosophy. Mr. Vance wanted Julian gone. Julian didn't know about this, but Arthur did. One evening, Julian was waiting for Arthur in the principal's office. He was sitting on the leather sofa, reading a book. The door opened, and Arthur walked in. But he didn't look like his usual composed self. His suit jacket was off, his tie was discarded, and he looked utterly exhausted. He locked the door behind him and practically collapsed onto the sofa next to Julian, pulling Julian into his arms and burying his face in Julian's neck. "Arthur? What's wrong?" Julian asked, immediately alarmed, running his fingers through Arthur's perfectly styled hair, messing it up. Arthur just held him tighter, breathing in the scent of Julian. "I had a meeting with the board today. They want to terminate your contract." Julian's heart dropped into his stomach. The book slipped from his hands. "What? Why? My students have the highest engagement rates in the county." "Because they are old, rigid fools who don't understand you," Arthur said bitterly, lifting his head to look at Julian. His gray eyes were fierce, blazing with a protective fire that took Julian's breath away. "Vance demanded I fire you at the end of the term." Julian felt tears prick his eyes. He loved this school. He loved his students, and the thought of leaving, the thought of not seeing Arthur every day, it was crushing. So what happens now? Am I fired?" Arthur reached up, gently wiping a tear that had escaped down Julian's cheek. His thumb was warm, his touch so infinitely tender. "No," Arthur said, his voice hard as steel. "You are not going anywhere. I told Vance that if he fires you, he loses me." Julian gasped, his eyes going wide. "Arthur, no! You can't do that. You worked your entire life for a position like this. You're the youngest principal in the school's history. You can't throw your career away for me." "Julian, look at me," Arthur commanded softly, taking both of Julian's hands in his, kissing the knuckles of each hand. "Before I came to this school, my life was just work. Spreadsheets, discipline, empty prestige. It was cold. You are the only warmth I have ever felt. You brought life back into this school, and you brought life into me. I would burn this entire academy to the ground before I let anyone take you away from me." The sheer magnitude of Arthur's love, of his unyielding loyalty, broke open something deep inside Julian's chest. He realized, in that moment, that this wasn't just a secret office romance. This was it. This was the man he was going to spend the rest of his life with. Julian leaned forward, cupping Arthur's face in his hands, pressing his lips to Arthur's in a deeply emotional, tear-stained kiss. It was a kiss of profound gratitude, of absolute devotion. "I love you," Arthur murmured back, his voice thick with emotion, pressing a lingering kiss to Julian's forehead. "I love you so much, Julian. I will always protect you. Always." And he kept his promise. The fallout with the board was intense, but Arthur was a force of nature. He presented mountains of data proving the success of Julian's methods. He threatened to take the entire staff on strike, leveraging the loyalty he had quietly built over the year. In the end, the board backed down. Julian's job was safe, and his arts program was fully funded. The school year ended with the grand spring gala. The grand hall was decorated with flowers, the students were dancing, and the teachers were celebrating a successful year. Julian stood near the punch bowl, watching the crowd. He was wearing a fitted navy suit, looking handsome and relaxed. From across the room, his eyes met Arthur's. Arthur was standing near the stage, looking like a king in his dark tuxedo. He wasn't smiling. He rarely smiled in public, but the way his stormy gray eyes looked at Julian was filled with a soft, private, burning adoration. Slowly, subtly, Arthur tilted his head toward the side doors, giving Julian a secret signal. Julian's heart fluttered. He waited a few moments, then quietly slipped out the side doors, stepping out into the cool, fragrant spring night air in the school courtyard. A moment later, the heavy door opened again, and Arthur stepped out into the shadows of the ancient oak trees. They were completely alone. The music from the gala drifted softly through the open windows. Arthur didn't say a word. He just walked over to Julian, grabbed him by the lapels of his navy suit, and pulled him into a slow, breathless, incredibly romantic kiss under the moonlight. Julian melted against him, tangling his fingers in Arthur's hair, sighing softly into the kiss. "You look beautiful tonight, Mr. Hayes," Arthur murmured against Julian's lips, his hands resting possessively on Julian's hips. "You're not so bad yourself, Mr. Sterling," Julian teased, a bright smile on his face, his eyes shining with absolute happiness. Arthur pulled him into a tight, warm hug, resting his chin on Julian's head. They stood there in the quiet courtyard, surrounded by the history of the school, two men who had started as complete opposites, only to find that they were exactly what the other needed. The strict, icy principal had found his warmth, and the chaotic, passionate teacher had found his anchor. They had a long road ahead of them, navigating their careers, keeping their relationships safe, and building a life together. But as Julian stood there, wrapped in Arthur's strong, protective arms, listening to the steady beat of Arthur's heart, he knew one thing for absolute certain. He was exactly where he belonged. Thank you so much for listening to this story. I truly hope you enjoyed the journey between Julian and Arthur as much as I enjoyed telling it to you. If you want to dive deeper into their world and see what happens next behind closed doors, remember that you can find the continuation of the videos, bonus scenes, early access, and more uncensored 18+ BL content over on my Patreon, SpicyTimeBL. Your support there means the world to me and is what makes this channel possible. You can find the link in the description below and in the pinned comment. Until next time, take care and stay romantic.